And we're going to focus on the hurdle step today. But you don't need a hurdle to do it. Okay, so the FMS is the functional movement screen. And it was designed by a physical therapist named Greg Cook, who's pretty involved with physical therapy, but also the sports training world. And it was designed to be a screen of several movements. Now, I'm not going to cover all the movements today. I want to break down the hurdle step, and I'll go over what that is and maybe the lunge test. But the whole object, Gray's philosophy, is the body moves in patterns of movements. You'll never hear him talking about, you know, you have a weak iliacus, or the way he sometimes, or you have a weak. He talks about patterns of movement. This is a hip flexion pattern, okay? And if you have a weak or a faulty hip flexion pattern, it can cause problems. You have a lunge pattern, but if you have a poor lunge pattern, you know, he's not going to say your quad is weak or you got to build your VMO. He's going to say you got to improve your lunge pattern. So he talks about the patterns of movements, the squat pattern, the lunge pattern, the hip flexion pattern, thoracic mobility, etc. All the patterns, the diagonal patterns. He talks a lot about the diagonal patterns of movement. So the FMS was a screen that was put together to look at these patterns of movements. Now, one of the main things that FMS looks for is asymmetries. Now, when we think of asymmetries, we think of the left to right side of the body. In other words, if you lack ankle mobility, you start a squat and your ankle doesn't, you lack dorsiflexion, this knee is going to stop and this one's going to continue to go, and you're going to see a shift. I'll show you one I have. If you check thoracic mobility and you lack internal rotation on one side, this is my left side, versus if you've had injuries to a shoulder, which is my right side, see how it's blocked? So you're going to see a reduction left to right side. But you're also going to see reductions in planes of motion. And this is what I'm going to talk about a lot about today, where you see a lot of hip injuries and a lot of weaknesses. Typically, when we stretch the hips, we work in the frontal plane. So we do lots of exercises where we work on getting into the stretch like this. We have machines that are designed to straighten this in the frontal planes, the adductor machine for the hips. But if you have an asymmetry in hip mobility, in other words, if your hips go way out this way because you've been working on this, but you have an asymmetry in extension, meaning you lack hip extension, you have a ton of motion going this way, but you lack hip extension motion, which is very typical. We see this all the time. We see people compensate. How do they compensate? They hyperextend the spine. If you have a ton of motion in the frontal plane, but you lack motion in the sagittal plane, you are going to develop a lot of hip problems and or abdominal, lower abdominal problems, or etc. I'll get into that. Sports hernias. We see this with hockey and soccer players. A lot of the work I'm doing with Achievers now stems on this. The soccer players have all this mobility medial lateral. They lack hip extension. And they keep pulling their groins. They keep having sports hernias, and they need more hip extension motion. And the reason being, if you block hip extension motion and you have to move in a sagittal plane, your pelvis starts shifting left to right. That puts a lot of loads on the lower abdominal, on the labrum of the hip. Then you start developing hip problems. I'm jumping ahead a little too soon. Let me go back to that. But that's what the functional movement screen looks at. It looks at asymmetries and talks about that. Are you asymmetrical left to right? Are you asymmetrical in one plane of motion versus another? You got full motion this way, but you're blocked this way. Make sense? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we look at all our planes of motions. You have full motion in this plane, but you lack rotational range of motion. So you can have an asymmetry within a plane of one plane of motion to another. It doesn't always have to be left to right side. If you see an asymmetry, you're going to have a problem at some point down the road, irrespective of what the joint is. So the test I'm going to first lead into is the hurdle step. And the beauty of this stuff is you don't have to memorize it per se, like, do I have to do an FMS screen on all my clients? I personally don't. I just warm them up, and I look at their motion as I'm warming up. I simplify that. It's good to know how to do an FMS, and I would recommend people take the course, or we'll teach it here, but the way I look at it is I have people warm up. So the structured way the FMS is done is you have a hurdle, the height of your ischial tuberosity, which is just below your kneecap. And the test looks at left to right motion. Can you step over the hurdle, clear it, and come down, tap the heel? So basically, can you clear your knee? Now, what are compensations going to look like? Okay, you might have a lateral shift. Okay, so you do this. They have to clear the hurdle, which is the ischial tuberosity height. They have to do this. They abduct and they shift. They can't stay straight here. Okay, why would someone do that? That's what you have to start asking the question. And this is Not necessarily what the FMS will tell you, but you can tell they have a faulty hip flexion pattern. You have to figure out why they have a faulty hip flexion pattern, and you look at left to right side. Okay? So why might someone have a lateral shift to clear the hurdle? Could be lots of reasons. One, what would be the mobility reason?
Posterior.
They lack hip flexion. They have hip. So a physical therapist would typically then put them on the floor and do what? Let's do it passively. Are they jammed here? When they get to here, is this as far as they can go with the knee straight like this? Or what happens? They get to here and what happens? They're blocked and they have to go this way to get the knee up further. We see this all the time. Usually that correlates right away. We know they're going to lack internal rotation of the hip. They have an asymmetry. They don't have enough internal rotation range of motion. That's why we give people what stretch? This stretch. Which is why on almost any, you'll see me with all my clients, it's just part of the movement preparation. Every client I have has to warm up and do this. The pigeon stretch, or whatever you want to call it. Because most of them, at some point as they age, are going to lose hip flexibility, capsular mobility, and then their hip flexion pattern is going to turn into this. And then one day they're going to say, oh, the front of my hip hurts, or something else hurts. It's because they lost hip mobility. So when we see this, one of the reasons is they lack hip flexion, or the leg going to external rotation, because they lack hip mobility. Back hip capsules tight. So they have to recenter their hip flexion, which is another reason warm up. We do this in the warm up, right? This becomes part of the warm up to get hip mobility. Just use this in the warm up cycle. Okay? I'm going to open the door because it's hot in here. I don't mind the noise if you guys don't. Is it going to interfere?
No, it's fine.
Okay. Okay, so you start thinking about when you find something, finding something I find is irrelevant. It's what do you do about it? So if you see this, you know, you just warm people up, have them do this. Can they clear their knees? And are they hiking their hip? If it is, you know you got to have something in their warm-up that addresses hip flexion. What's the other reason someone might hike the hip? Let's say you put them on their back and you check their knee flexion and voila, the knee goes straight up without external rotation. Well, they've got the hip flexion, you can see it. So if their knee is going out now, it's not a mobility issue, it's a stability strength issue. They're weak in their hip flexors. And I'll break that down in a minute what that means. But so they're weak here, so to get it up, they can't come up any higher. So they have to hike or externally rotate or do something to clear the hurdle. Does that make sense? So then we start testing strength and stability to see, is it a strength stability issue? And this is what we're going to break this down. So everyone come into standing. Let's go through it. So everyone look in the mirror. Ischial tuberosity, just or the bottom of your kneecap. Find the bottom of your kneecap, and that's what you have to clear. So we could get real specific with a hurdle and do the full MFS screen, or just pull back and pretend there's an imaginary hurdle there, and step over your knee and see if you can clear it. Now your knee, if you're looking at it from a side plane, which sometimes help, your knee should be up at this angle. And you should be able to have an above 90-degree angle, maybe 100 degrees, 110, and not compensate with tipping. So everyone should see that. Above 90 degrees. If you can't get above 90 degrees, you have weakness in your deep hip flexors. That is positive. I see a couple of you that are struggling. No one's like a pure on, I'll give you the grading system. No one's a 1 where it's complete unable to do it. But I definitely see a couple 2s where there's compensation or you can't clear the motion fully without a little compensation.
What's the scale?
I'm going to go through that, yeah. So everyone got a feel of that? So you're looking at what your clients is, side view, the bow and arrow. Are they straight? Can they get that knee up? Really driving it. The front view, you're looking for shifts. Is the knee going up to the side? Is there kind of a tip? Okay? Some of you are probably... That's a positive test. That says, well, that tells you it's a positive test, but it might not be a positive test for the hip flexor element. It's a positive test for what? Core instability. The only way you can, your core is unstable, so you have to swivel the pelvis to clear it. And if your core is unstable, your hip will be unstable. Remember this previous lectures we've talked about. Everything begins with the core and flows upstream, downstream. I'm going to cover that in a minute. But if your core is weak, you'll test weak with hip flexion. Okay, so that's the gist of the hip flexion test. But it's a very important test, particularly if you have athletes, soccer player, hockey players, kids who run. They all develop hip issues, groin pulls. And the reason for that is because they're weak with the hip flexion element, or they lack mobility with the hip flexion element. So you have to incorporate that into their exercise program. I like to incorporate it into the warm-up, and I'll break down how I do that. Grading system. Okay. If you can complete the test, I'm going to start backwards. If you have any pain at any point, even if you can complete the test, it's a 0. Meaning I can complete it, but I get a pinch. And I see this a lot too. The pinching pain that you feel, that people will describe in the groin, is usually always a sign that they lack mobility somewhere in the hips. Usually internal rotation or hip extension. And the ball is going too far forward and it's pinching in the socket. So even if they can complete the range, they get a 0, and they should be referred to a therapist, and I'll show you guys some mobilization techniques I use. That means as the ball rolls up, it's going too far forward in the socket, and it's pinching on the tissue in the front, and that causes a referral pain pattern towards the pubic symphysis, also called the inguinal area. So when you see this, and they're like, yeah, it's in the groin, or a little bit of jam in the back, even if they can complete it, they get a 0. Now, most of the time, when I see people who get the pain, almost 90% of the time they can't complete it. When they get the pinch, they compensate. So very rarely do I see 0s where someone has pain and they can do it well. Usually they don't do it well. Does that make sense? Okay. A 1 is they can't complete the movement, meaning you got to step over the hurdle, you just can't do it. So that's a 1. You just can't do the motion. You can't do it, period. The 2 is compensation. We talked about that. You flex the hip. You shift. It can be any number one of the compensations. And the 3 is you can complete it with good stability and control. That's how all the tests are based. Make sense? Okay, so what do we do when we see this positive sign here? Okay, well, first thing we do is simple. Put them on the back, check the range of motion like I showed you. If they can go straight without compensating, right away, you know that they have hip flexion mobility. Looking for a map. But I'll show you the things. But once you have them on the ground, this is what I do. This is kind of a PT thing, but anyone can do it. I mean, you're not limited to the PT and training role, but at this day and age, it's blended. Everyone who's a PT should be a trainer. And everyone who's a trainer should have some basic understanding of biomechanics of joints, and just do a quick scan. Wendy, go back here for me, please, if you don't mind. So if I'm going to check her hip flexion, she's on her back. I might as well check her hip internal rotation, right? So can she go straight up without compensating? Yeah, she's looking at 120 degrees. Sorry, me.
Yeah.
This side better?
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay. So, plenty of motion there. But while she's here, I might as well just check her internal rotation. You'd be surprised, and again, what I'm looking for is does she have to hike her hip? Don't let the hip hike, and just do this. Okay, so she's not hiking, she's there at 45 degrees. You'd be surprised how many people you find that's blocked here. So right away you know they lack hip internal rotation. You gotta have them doing the posterior capsule stretch. Yeah, so you're looking for that stretch here. Now if they get the hip impingement pain here, when you do this, they're like, it's in the groin, it's sharp, then you know you gotta send them to PT because they need some mobilization work in the hip to reduce that. But right away, you just did a full scan, right? External rotation, look at her difference though. She does lack a little internal. External here, internal, she's there. See the difference?
It's mostly because of that.
In the knee?
Yeah.
Open up the angle.
Yeah, it's better.
Yeah, but still, there's a difference. Internal and external is asymmetrical. She's closer to 90 with external. She's a little bit blocked with internal.
Seriously, can you get to 90 on
Not 45 degrees.
Oh, it's like...
But you're hypermobile with external, a little hypomobile with internal. So ideally you want to see them closer, 45, 50, 45, closer. This is a little bit blocked, I can feel it. And she'll compensate. How does she compensate? Hikes the hip. So right away I know in her movement prep, we need some posterior capsule stretch. So this is going to be part, and she her hip flexion's okay, straight, but she's going to be doing something like this before, she moves that hip joint up. Something where to loosen up the back hip capsule. So that's a quick screen. If
but
you
isn't
see
that getting in where I'm already hypermobile through there, that way? Mobile? Like
that's a great question. It gives the illusion that you're actually increasing the external rotation. What you're freeing up is the posterior hip capsule. And the posterior hip capsule, if it frees up, will give you more internal rotation. It's very similar to the shoulder, ball and socket joints. If you want to improve internal rotation of the shoulder, you have to free up the posterior capsule. So we loosen up the posterior capsule like this. See how I'm stretching this? So this would be like, you could even do it on the floor, right? Same thing, right? I'm freeing up the posterior capsule, which gives me more internal rotation. We do it with the TRX, right? Ooh, someone grab the TRX at some point. I'll demonstrate with this, but posterior capsule stretch, right, where I do this, that improves my internal rotation. So, does that make sense? Okay, I think so. So you can easily put someone on the floor right away, if they can't do this, and just do a quick scan. Can they hip flex? If it deviates out, check their rotation. Okay? Check their abduction. Pull the leg out to the side, see how much motion I think it's going to be. Here's that posterior capsule stretch on the shoulder. Okay. Right, you guys have seen this. That's why we do this one. To free up the back of the shoulder so we improve our internal rotation range of motion. What does it look like on the hip? Like this, and I'm just driving the hip, or like this, right? I'm trying to get that back hip capsule stretched. And that gives me more ability to create a neutral hip flexion pattern without having that posterior capsule influence and having the dominance of external rotation as I lift the leg up. If your leg's deviating out here, you probably have a tight posterior hip capsule that needs to be stretched. Remember, it's all about the pattern of movement. Watch a sprinter warming up. They're working on perfect symmetry. They can't run fast if their legs are rolling out to external rotation, or if they have to have full motion, and then eventually that translates to power. Everything has to be symmetrical. Sprinters spend hours every day working on symmetrical motion, and they try to find out what that restriction is. So, range of motion in the hip is key. Anything else there? Okay, so let's go through the anatomy of the muscles that flex the hip. This is what the title of the lecture is, breaking down the FMS, because the FMS will teach us how to do this. It's not going to break down what's happening. You got to go deeper. Okay, what are our hip flexors? We've got several hip flexors. We've got muscles that attach on the pelvis. The main ones that come to mind, rectus femoris, which goes all the way down to here. Is it a 1 or 2 joint muscles?
2.
How many joints does it cross? If it starts here, it crosses the hip. Where does it insert? Below the knee. So it's a very long lever hip flexor. Okay? Second muscle attaches on the pelvis goes down. Iliotibial band, right? More of a lateral approach all the way to the lateral tibial plateau down here. Okay, so it actually comes down at an angle, and it's biased. When you flex the hip, it's going to have an internal rotation bias. Okay, so it affects alignment of the axis of rotation in the hip joint. Third one, sartorius, kind of a cross pattern. Okay. What is the dominant hip flexor, though, that I didn't mention, that attaches right at the axis of rotation, which means it doesn't attach on the iliacus, it attaches actually more on the inside here, and it attaches right at the trochanter, or lesser trochanter, the inside of the hip here. Iliacus? Iliacus. Not psoas, iliacus. McGill actually doesn't believe in ilio. You hear the term iliopsoas all the time. McGill did a great paper on that. He doesn't believe in iliopsoas. Psoas goes segment to segment to segment. Iliacus goes from pelvis to trochanter. So he doesn't ever, you never hear him refer to it as iliopsoas. Psoas, spine stability, iliacus, hip stability. Okay. Iliacus attaches right near the hip joint. That should be your dominant hip flexor. If it's weak, why, just like the rotator cuff, why is it important our rotator cuff functions well? Because these are the muscles with the tightest axis of control. Does everyone know what I mean by that? It's the muscles that attach closest to the joint. Here's my femur, right? Do I want the axis of motion to be controlled by a muscle or muscles that attach near the axis of rotation? And visualize my elbow being the tibia down there, or muscles which go all the way down past that joint, that have a long lever arm. Look at the axis of rotation if my rectus femoris becomes dominant. Okay? If you have a muscle that's flexing the hip, but it's flexing it by virtue of a long lever arm, the torque it's creating on the joint is driving the joint way out of the axis of rotation. Versus if you have a tight muscle pulling on it, see how it stays tightly in the socket? All joint mechanics fall apart when the axis of rotation is thrown off. where the force is driving the ball of a ball and socket joint like this, shearing, gliding. Long lever arm muscles, iliotibial sartorius, will do that. Now, why did the rectus femoris, and this is why we see so many quad strains with soccer players and hockey players, which muscle group is weakened and deactivated? Iliacus. And how do we test that? We see this all the time. And how does any muscle become deactivated? Poor posture. We talked about this with the PPM courses. If you sit all day long on a computer, this is the virtue of what you do, the muscles in a shortened state, it just becomes deactivated. If I sit like this with my upper body, which muscles become deactivated in my thoracic spine and my scapula? Deactivation of my rhomboids, my lower traps, then I can't get into proper alignment to create force tension. You sit with your hips flexed all the time, you'll deactivate the iliacus. If you play hip-dominant sports where you're in a flexed posture, ice hockey, you're in a flexed position. Unless you do something to realign and reestablish proper mechanics in your exercise program, you'll deactivate the iliacus. Keep in mind, most of these players have been playing soccer or hockey, especially at the high level, since they've been 5 years old. So by the time, I'll look at them at 22, they've shut down the iliacus. They are dominant where? Rectus femoris, ITB, sartorius. They're creating huge torque patterns in their hip joint, kicking a ball, or explosive, boom, stride. Ice hockey players, right? Boom, stride, boom. Their hip flexion pattern, but what's driving their femur forward? Rectus femoris, ITB, sartorius, because their iliacus is deactivated because they're in a flexed posture all the time. Not all of them, but many of them. And that's probably why you always hear soccer players and hockey players always pulling groins. And I'm going to get into that. The adductor muscle group. All this, you can see where I'm going, layer upon layer upon layer, by doing what? Step over a hurdle. What do you see? See how deep you can get with this? Layer upon layer. I've only touched like 2 layers. We're going to take another 5 layers deeper as to what happens when you see this. Starting from mobility to stability to deactivation. So we have to reactivate. Now the beauty of all this is you don't have to know the biomechanics in this type of detail. All you need to know is you got to do something to re-strengthen their hip flexion pattern and reestablish it. And we're going to run through a series of things you can do in the warm-up cycle that will do that. But one of the flaws I see in warm-ups all the time is that people warming up and just doing this, right? What height do you have to get the iliacus to turn on? 90 degrees plus. So if you're going to do the walking lunge as a warm-up, it can't just be this. It has to be that last bit of hip flexion, hip extension with a quiet core to really get into those weak layers of the hip flexors, the iliacus particularly. The iliacus test we test is this. Sit like this. Compensation is this. See it? Or hyperextension. So we have to sit tall, shoulders back, or stabilize like this. I like this, but Boyle does this. I prefer this. I can get my lats in. Get my lats to help stabilize. Hip flexion. Can you get up past 90 without an external rotation component? Right there. Straight. Now, ideally, you want your feet off the floor when you test people. That's why I brought this high stool out. Then you can give them a little force and check for asymmetries. Almost all the time, you feel one leg buckle. Whenever I have an athlete that has hip impingement, or I see one, they almost always test positive for this. It gives. Or they compensate. They have a weak iliacus. They're dominant rectus femoris, ITB, and then they start pulling quadriceps. They start pulling, and typically what do we say? They go to the sports guy and they're like, oh, your quad's weak. Open chain knee extension, do squats. If you don't address the iliacus, they go running again, they're going to pull the quad again. Why do they pull the quad? Because the primary muscle that should be establishing a good hip flexion pattern took off for vacation. As long as that guy's on vacation, you're going to keep pulling your quad with ballistic sports. Okay? So we got to straighten that. All this again, you do it. Standing hip flexion test. You get all this information right from doing that. The groin. Okay. Groin pulls. We probably see groin pulls in epidemic proportions with hockey players and soccer players. Why is that? The groin muscles, let's break the groin down. What is the groin? It's that inguinal area in the hip here. The pubic symphysis, okay? It's this area right below the pubic symphysis that these adductor muscles come tying into. Okay, and you got 5 of them. You know, adductor magnus, longus, brevis, pectineus, gracilis. You can see my pant leg. That's a perfect example of it. See the striations? That actually gives a good illusion of what the adductor muscle groups do and the attachment right on the pubic symphysis. That's a great analogy of it right there. From the top end of it, attaching just on the opposite side are what muscle groups? The abdominals. Lower abdominal referred to as right there. So you can see you have this co-contraction synergy of the muscles on the front and muscles on the bottom. How often do you see people who have a strain or a tender deep in this area here or below? Pretty often. And it's micro-tearing of muscles, either lower abdominal or upper abdominal, okay? Or adductor muscle group. Why would you have micro-tears of the adductor group? Because, like you have tears of any muscle group, some muscles are being overworked because someone didn't show up for work. Iliacus didn't show up. Okay? What are your 2 adductor muscle groups? You've got 5 of them. The 2 that are significant are adductor brevis. And this is, you don't have to memorize this. The key is to know that you have 2 adductor muscle groups that assist with flexion. You have 3 that assist with extension. Because we think of the adductors as what? Sit on the adductor machine and do this. That's pure adduction, which is not how the adductors work in everyday life, which is why, you know, I have one client who wants to use that machine every time and he's stuck on it, and I'll let him use it, but he's never ever going to stop straining his hip using that adductor machine, because it's just pure frontal plane. You need to work your adductors with a flexion component or an extensor component, depending on what the bias is. So the 2 muscles that get overworked, ice hockey player, again, analogy. I'm here. Look at the stretch. Adductor pectineus and adductor brevis, thank you. Those are my flexors, okay? 2 of the adductor groups, regardless, you don't have to memorize them. They're on a stretch here, right? If my iliacus, which is my dominant hip flexor, is off on vacation because it's deactivated because I'm always in a flexion posture and I'm never working it properly, this adductor muscle group has to work extra hard to do what? Drive me forward. Then I start over time to do what? Micro-tear it, because it's weak at the level where it attaches. Hence, there goes the pull. So I can try to strengthen the adductors all day on that adductor machine, but until I turn the iliacus on, until I retrain the adductor with a flexion pattern, I'm always going to have a pull. And then this is what we're going to go over. We're going to do some lap stuff. I want you guys to understand conceptually what's going on. Jim, hold this for me, please. Just step on that as you would. Okay, so think of the adductor machine, that'd be great. Okay, versus this. See the difference in the pattern? Adductor machine sitting hip flexion with adduction and iliacus, right? Past 90 degrees. This is what hockey and soccer players need to be doing a lot of to prevent their strains. Okay, thanks. Big difference though than sitting on an adduction machine. Back to how did we diagnose this? Herbal test. Okay, just you see a positive herbal test, you start to wonder about weak hip flexors, strain on the adductors, start building some detective work in here. Why some your athletes are, in our case, most of our clients are what, 40s, 50s? I mean, they're hikers, they're bikers. Is a biker going to probably test positive with an iliacus? Flexion dominant pattern. Over time they will, right? They stay in a sagittal plane. Do they ever use the leg in a diagonal plane? They're probably going to have a lot of strain. And then if they go play tennis or something, no wonder they're going to have a strain there. Okay. Sports hernias. As soon as your adductor group gets weak here, as soon as your iliacus gets weak, you know, and if you lack hip extension, which you'll find with a lot of these people, why do they lack hip extension? They're flexion dominant. They sit all day, or they play flexion sports. Hockey players, flexion sports. As soon as you lack hip extension, your hip doesn't have the ability to move like this anymore, so that you get blocked and the pelvis starts moving like this more. The lower abdominals take a lot more strain. There's your rip of your lower abdominal wall right there when you sense that. That's a sports hernia if it gets big enough where things can protrude through it. The early stages of a sports hernia, whether it's inguinal, this area here, or lower abdominal, adductor strain, lower abdominal strain, then you start to see things start to rip in this inguinal area. All starts with what? Lack of hip extension, weak iliacus, bad hip flexion pattern. Okay? Another layer on top of layer of things we're starting to see with injuries. Okay? Or lack of performance. If you want to be explosive and fast like a sprinter, if you lack hip extension, if you lack explosive hip flexion pattern, if you lack core stability, you're not going to be as explosive. You know? And if you are, your explosive works against you, you're going to start ripping tissue. You know, it's kind of like you can't put a Ferrari engine into a Pinto and expect the body to hold. The whole car is going to break down with that type of power. So sprinters have to have all these things addressed before they do what? Put it into fifth gear. Otherwise, things are going to start ripping, and this is what's happening to these soccer players. Most of these soccer players are pretty good athletes, pretty explosive, pretty strong, but they lack hip extension, they lack a good hip flexion pattern, and they're always pulling their groin, they're always pulling their quad, they're always pulling their hamstrings. Again, the hamstring's a different one, which I'll address with the next movement pattern. But this is why. And they all test positive: lack of internal rotation, lack of hip extension, weakness in the hip flexion pattern. It's epidemic, and you'll find this with kids too. 80% you'll find this pattern. And this is where it all stems from. Test, hip flexion pattern, start to look at it. Okay. So, do I want to go any deeper into that, or do I want to just put you guys through some labs of things? And the way I address this is I put it in the movement prep. Every athlete has to go through this movement prep routine to engage the core, to engage the hip flexion pattern. So by the time we're loading them with heavy weight, the patterns improved. The activation of the weak muscle groups improved. You're just trying to fire up things. And that's what, I don't know if you guys are watching ESPN. Carson Palmer is working with Greg Roscoff, who invented MAT. You know, so they're doing tissue work, right? I mean, his is a shoulder injury, but it's the same thing. It doesn't matter if it's a shoulder or hip. You're trying to get in there to dig into muscle groups at the neuroreceptor level to do what? Facilitate muscle activation. But you can't stop there, because if you do all this, you know, rolling on rollers and balls and you facilitate muscle groups, if you let them go back to the same pattern that they were doing, it's just going to deactivate again. If they sit all day, it's going to deactivate. So we can use any technique we want to help facilitate a muscle. MIT, I call it neurological facilitation by its roots. Rolling on it. You can do whatever you want, stretch, contract, relax. You still have to change the pattern. So that's what we're going to do now. Questions before I move on? Okay. What do we, if we want to start to re-educate the hip flexion pattern, what do we have to begin with? It's always the same answer when you hear these lectures.
Core stabilization.
Core stabilization. Because if you have a weak core, as soon as you drive the hip up, the bucket's loose. You get two buckets, right? We got the pelvic bucket, rib bucket. If you're weak here, you can't maintain your buckets. You go to flex, you fall forward here, or you hyperextend here. The buckets have to be able to maintain alignment. Doesn't matter what the injury is. If we're talking about Achilles tendonitis, starts here. And, you know, everything begins here. So, everyone grab the mat. Let's say everyone grab a TRX. And we're going to start going through the movement prep of how to address these hip flexor issues. Okay, we're going to use the bands after. Let the brain go a little bit. So everyone, you'll pair up and we do some band stuff. Okay, so let's start off with the mats. We've got 20 minutes. We should be able to get out through all this. So I don't think I'm going to go into the second test today, because we can say that, which is the lunge, which opens up a whole new window of things that work in combination with this. Okay, so let's start off with the plank, right? So if we want the hip flexor to get engaged, we got to get the core, glutes, and sector space. Feet together. We're just going to do it. You guys have done this 1,000 times, but we know this. Elbows in. Okay. Anything that helps keep the back still, we've got to turn on. I don't care if we start from the head down or toes up. Pull the elbows towards the belly, lats engaged. Lat anatomy, origin insertion, all the way from the shoulder, all the way to the SI joint. So if you pull on it, it's like a shirt, tightening like this. It's going to help keep the back wide. So moderate force, pull, okay? Squeeze the abdominals, tense them, moderate force. Squeeze the gluteals, tense your quads, push your heels together, pop up. Right there where you've got a contraction, and if you visualize pulling your toes towards your elbows, you actually do have a contraction of iliacus with abdominals, with lats. Feel the sleeve turn on and down. Big difference in just who can do a plank the longest time and just sag on their ligaments. Again, I don't care how long you can do a plank. I care about can you get the spine neutral and can you activate the muscle groups which are going to help keep the back still when we start firing your lever arms, your femur and your shoulder girdle. 2 or 3 of them, right? Remember, the goal is to rev up the system. It's not to make this into, can I rip my abdominals as I do this? Okay? Now, if you want to be creative and put your feet in the TRX plank, great. Side plank, side wall. Top foot forward, you guys know this, it's a bridge motion. Drive the hips up, glutes tight, depress the right elbow towards your belly so you get your lat kicked in. 10 seconds, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, switch over, other side. You guys can be creative. I mean, we all have our own routine we do, but this all comes in good. Rotational element, push-up position, that you know, arm to the shoulder. Keep your core facing down. Activate those rotators of the hip. Push those hands into the floor tight. Externally rotate. This part of your forearm should rotate around forward. Feel that so you get your lats kicked in. Yeah, so we get some rotational control, okay? Bridges, right? If we want to have good hip flexion patterns, it's good to get the glutes kicked in. I like to put the toes up, feel the glutes engage. Good, okay? Break. So we got some stability, okay? And of course we can take that to multiple other layers. The other one I always put in is the half knee one, because again, I like to lengthen the iliacus while the glute contracts. So lengthen iliacus, lengthen front of the hip capsule, glute abdominals. You can use punching. If I had a band behind me, I can punch to help create some rotation. You can use the TRX to create length. We're trying to lengthen and activate the glute. Because a muscle that's lengthened, you're much more likely to get some overflow and some recruitment to than a muscle that's shortened. So you got to lengthen these muscles we want to fire up after. Okay? Pretty basic stuff there, okay? Mobility, which I usually do the mobility first to make a difference. Back to your back. We just did some mobility to the front of the hip capsule. Your hip flexion pattern, can you bring that knee in without any deviation? So kneaded chest print comes on a whole new meaning when you think about it this way. Posterior capsule stretch, right? You can do it in this position.
I got a quick question. So when you're doing the pure flexion mobilization, do you pay attention to supination, pronation?
I prefer dorsiflexion because, you know, again, if we get into running, you want the dorsiflexion element and you get greater gluteal recruitment with dorsiflexion. Okay, yeah, good question. Okay, and then the piriformis, I don't call this a piriformis stretch. Some people do. I call it a posterior capsule stretch. That stretch you feel behind the hip is the posterior capsule, the leather component of the leg. And that feeds nicely into, if you want to go into this position, right? Here's some of the rationale, right? Okay. We want our hip flexion pattern. We need hip mobility to have a good hip flexion pattern, right? But we got to start thinking about iliacus firing, which means we want to start to deactivate the rectus femoris, the ITB. Let's start stretching these muscles out. A little bit more ITB length here. Get the ITB lengthened out. You get straighten the knee. You go straight here, but see, I'm also cranking the posterior hip capsule. I'm just sitting on it. Yeah, you're running out of space there. You guys get the idea, right? Okay, so now let's start going into iliacus re-education. We're just going to do it from our back position, right? So, real simple. Make the knee straight, pull it past 90. Hand, gentle push on it. Abdominals engage. You also get lat engagement. I just use one hand. I push with the hand I'm up with. I feel my lat engaged. My abs are tight. My back isn't moving. Hold 6 seconds. And down. Okay? Pull it straight up, make sure everything is in alignment, give it a little push,
Moderate force, don't overwork it. Feel it deep in the hip flexor. It should burn right in that, inside that inguinal area. Feel it?
Yes.
But you've got to get past 90 degrees. Okay? Because again, when we come into standing, if you're not past 90, you got a problem. Now, combination, try the other side if you want. See if there's a difference. Engage your lat, abs engaged. Push on it and feel that hip flexor straight. Now external rotation. So if you have someone who deviates into external rotation when you do this, stretch their posterior capsule first, then do it and see if you can improve upon it. Okay? Good. Okay. And that can lead into some of these other ones that just actively. Can you actively improve the pattern with this flexion? Just improve the pattern. This could be part of the warm-up, right? Core stability. You're running, but you're really focusing on 90 degrees. You're focusing on straight pull of the hip. Okay? Can we overload this pattern? Absolutely. Now, you can try this with partners. There's two places you can place the band. I find if you want to re-educate the iliacus, you're better off putting the band above the knee. Hold that for me. And I'm going to assist them by just, because I don't have to go all the way down. I'm just going from here to here. Okay? And it's very similar to isometrically where you use your hand, but
It's got to be some iliacus.
that's it. So this really gets into the iliacus, and try not to hike the hip. And really changes the pattern. Now I could do it this way as well. The only issue with this way is there's a greater chance I might use my rectus femoris this way.
What if you contract your hamstring?
Yeah, so I get better isolation if I put the band up here, but it will be flimsy, so you got to hold it like this. Okay? Now the other pattern, actually Neil came up with this one. A sprinter does what? Reciprocally. He extends the right hip, because when you run, you do what? You extend one hip and flex the other. So here's the pattern. Hip extension right, hip flexion left. And again, over time, if you feel you really have a good iliacus firing, then it can look like this. And then later on, it could be a speed pattern. See how that whole hip flexion pattern? Okay, so pair up with a partner real quick and just get a feel of that. One person hold, one person resist. And just try it. You have to hold it in place.
Oh,
1, 2, 1.
Bill, you like to get on your heel? You like to get the ball?
I like toe up.
Toe up.
Yeah. So you put it in place. Okay, make sure you stay, before you lift that knee up, make sure you're stabilized, right? Don't just pull the knee up. Stabilize the core. Stabilize, use your lats.
I guess one thing that's a great indicator for me is if I feel my back, the different parts of my back touching the ground as I go into hip flexion, you know your core's not stable because that low back is shifting.
Yeah, and you could bend the opposite knee to assist, but whatever it takes to keep the back quiet. Is that what you? And you can change your hand, Morgan. See, I like to be horizontal, so change the vector. Lift your hand up higher. Yeah. Just grab further. There you go. Yeah.
Like this. See, that's it. You see, he's going into a little external rotation. See how he just adjusted it? Yeah, see if you can see if your partner is going into external rotation as they flex.
The thing that I was,
Look at their foot.
what I was asking about with the supination pronation, I always dorsiflex, but I notice on my right side I tend to supinate and dorsiflex while lifting like kind of the ball.
Yeah.
So it's the same external rotation.
It's correct. Yeah. But see if they lift, if you see it going into external rotation, which is usually telling you that they're tight with internal rotation. I promise you start looking, you'll find people with tight internal rotation. Okay. Now, that's one way you can do it, right? Okay, so that's the easiest way in terms of you start on your back. You know, the back gives you the position of greatest stability. So if someone's really unstable with their core, you want to do re-education on the back. Okay, can we do it from a plank position? Sure we can. And you could do it, you know, I use the Reebok board sometimes and the TRX, but again, it has to be smooth and you have to be stable. It doesn't matter if it's the knees, you know, and then, you know, actually need another towel here. Okay, so I'm here, okay? Now I find here, I can't get up high enough and I deviate out. So I almost have to go up into the push-up position to stay straight. See how I'm here? This hip flexion re-education, but I have to be straight. I'm trying not to go out here. It doesn't mean there's not a time to go out here and do stretches. Like, this is a great posterior hip capsule stretch that we emphasize all the time. I love this stretch. That's a capsule stretch. But in terms of re-educating the pattern, good core stability, so I can't be loosey-goosey. I've got to be locked. I'm actually tightening my left gluteal with my right hip flexion pattern and vice versa. Okay? And sometimes I actually like to go across the body to get the adductor component. If I want to be really creative, see the hip flexion with the adduction? That's what soccer and hockey players need. But what's the beauty of a plank? Major core stability while you do it. So try it on the floor if you want. I don't know how many towels I have. You guys want to grab towels? Or, you know, and I find that the floor is better, but this is the same concept with the TRX, right? You can do it with the TRX as well. I find people get a little sloppier on the TRX. You know, it doesn't, you know, it becomes all about the workout and the metabolic burn. Like, okay, let's do runners. It all becomes about heart rate, metabolism, as opposed to muscle re-education. That's why, as I said, things, you know, things where we're burning calories have a place. And maybe at the end of the workout, it's great just to be able to burn a ton of calories and not think about it. But if you're trying to build strong, fast athletes, injury-free athletes, it's got to be really precise. And you can't just let them just get tired and start. It's got to be really precise. If you want to, yeah, play with it. Try a couple straight patterns, but before you begin the motion, make sure you're completely locked out. And how many reps do you think you want to do?
Not many.
Exactly. You don't want to do many. You want to do 8 or 10 at the most, and then take a break and then interval it. Then 8 or 10. Because if you make it into a 1-minute exercise, it's just going to turn into a metabolic calorie burning exercise, and the whole thought process about position falls down the toilet.
How many sets would you do?
2 or 3.
2 or 3.
Yeah. Yeah, but it has to be precise. Yeah. Okay? Now, the one where you're coming across adductions, you know, my spine is turning a little bit, but it's more my whole pelvis is turning with it. See, my pelvis turns a little bit. So I'm trying not to flex and twist the spine. So I let my pelvis turn a little bit, but it's more or less it's an adduction component with a hip flexion component. Then even if I weren't using the towels, watch how ballistic I can get on this once I'm trained well. Okay, I can start off like this, watch me get ballistic. See it? Really dynamic. Okay? I can jump left to right into a skater pattern. But again, if the athletes that we're working with happen to be high-level hockey or soccer players, they have to get to that point, because that's the speed and power they're going to put on the field or the rink. They have to be able to do it ballistically with good control. That's where we want to take them. Now, can you do the plank pattern with cables or go here, go right here for me. Go in the push-up position, face away from me. Okay, dorsiflex your left foot. Okay. Okay, you know what I want. Okay, go up with the right, go into a full plank with your right foot. She could do it. Okay, pull it in straight. Good. Pull it in straight. Re-educate. Right there, the hip flexion pattern. Go with an adduction pattern now. Stay tight, don't let that core collapse. This is why we don't do a ton of reps. Take a breather, go down, okay? Now, what I want you to do now is add, this is more advanced. I wouldn't start with this. Bend your right leg so you're in the sprinter start. Reach forward a little further back with the right leg. Get in the sprinter start, get on the ball of your foot. Now walk your hands way up. Keep going, keep going. Now, thrust forward like you're coming out of the gates and flex the foot. Push, push, bend the knee to your chest. Oh, that's it. Now come back to me, bend the, ready, go. Explode. Keep the butt down, core quiet, up. Don't let the back flex. Tap, set, go. Feel your lats working, feel your hips working. Hip flexion pattern, re-educated, tap the foot every time. Tap the foot to the floor, set. Pause, 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 stop, 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 touch the floor. Touch the floor with the foot.
Oh, yeah.
Right there, okay. Reset.
Okay.
Every time. Core engaged. 1, 2, 3, pop. down. Come straight up with the foot when you go to your chest. Don't lift it in the air. Just drive it straight to your chest. 1, 2, 3, pull. There's nothing wrong with that's great. Yeah. And it can become metabolic, but again, we've got to get out of the habit of just, I like to have everyone stop, reset every rep. Reset, posture, 1, 2, 3, pop. And even add an isometric hold in. 1, 2, 3, pop, hold. Down. 1, 2, 3, pop, hold. Then maybe, okay, 3 of them. 1, 2, 3. Versus what we typically do is what? 1 minute. You'll never re-educate the hip flexion pattern that way, but you burn a ton of calories. So you got to find, but there's nothing wrong at the end of a workout, but we've got to find that delicate balance between re-education and everything being metabolic. Okay, everyone coming to standing now? Let's put the pattern just in standing together. I know it's almost 1. Okay? Let's do it just standing. March in place. Running. Pause it. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Good. Okay? Hands right here. Back step lunge. This is the second screen test. Take it up, knee up, hold. 1, 2, 3. Down. Up. Core tight. 1, 2, 3. Hands behind the head. Challenging the core more. 1, 2, 3. Up. Take a step forward. Without crashing. 1, 2, 3. Up. Other side. Okay? Right arm up tall. Okay? Visualize you have a kettlebell up here, right? Step. Push the left hand back. Lock the core. Feel the core lock down when that left hand goes back. Up. Other side. Hip flexion pattern. Down. Up. Hip flexion pattern. Down. Changing the pattern, even with tubings, okay? Hands right here. 45 degree. Slide it out. Up. Across the body, the opposite elbow. Down. Up. Spread it out if you want. Up. Across the body, opposite elbow. 45 degree on the way down. Try to go more out because you want to get more adduction. See if you can go wider more across. Visualize with tubing or cables. Got the idea? Start to re-educate the hip flexion pattern with an adduction component. TRX. You guys have done this, right? This one I actually do like a lot of the TRX. See the hip flexion pattern? Or this way. Hip flexion pattern. Adduction hip flexion pattern. 45 degree hip flexion pattern adduction. See, a little limited with the TRX where I can get my foot. Trying to bring it up and across. To get the adductor stronger as a hip flexion pattern with the iliacus. So I re-educate the iliacus, then I put the patterns in. It's a lot in one day. Good job, guys. Okay.
Thank you. Woo. Thank you.